Okay, great. Hello, everyone. I'm Joan Halderson. I'm the chair of Dunbar Earthquake and Emergency Preparedness. And I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight on our presentation. Our speaker is one of our own deep core members, Jonathan Eaton. And Jonathan, turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Christian, also for helping out with the AV, and for Deep and the Community Center for having me here. Christian, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, excellent. So yeah, tonight I'm going to talk about culture and disasters, which is something that is not often put together in the same sentence. As John mentioned, I'm a PhD student at UBC, just up the road, in anthropology, and I'll tell a bit about myself in a second. But just first, here's where we're going to go tonight. My plan is to talk for just about 40 minutes, maybe a little less, hopefully. And ideally, that'll leave some time for questions and discussion towards the end. So first, I'll talk a little bit about me. I'm going to get into anthropology a bit. That's my field. That's the discipline that I work and do research in. And I think that it'll be really great to just talk about how anthropology approaches this concept of disasters, because it's a bit different from other fields and how they approach it. Then I'm going to get into what my research and topic is really about, which is disasters and cultural heritage. And I'm going to go over a few examples around the world, and then coming back to here in the Pacific Northwest and to Vancouver. And I'm going to talk a bit about why this matters, in my opinion, to talk about these topics. And then hopefully, like I said, at the end, some time for discussion with you all and time for questions. So a bit about me. Since we work with people in society, anthropologists really like to talk about themselves a bit in our work, because we don't see ourselves being separate from the work. And so this isn't just me kind of grandstanding about myself, but me trying to let you know a bit who I am, to let you know how I came to the work that I came to. Hi. Like I mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate right now, which means that I've done my field work and I'm just writing my dissertation at the University of British Columbia in the anthropology department. And I'm also working for UBC as a coordinator for the Disaster Resilience Research Network, which is a fantastic way to get to know a lot of other professors and faculty members up at UBC that are doing work in disasters from all sorts of different perspectives. But going back a ways, I was born in Alberta, but actually grew up kind of in this region in the Northwest, in Washington State on the Olympic Peninsula. And actually one of my first experiences from my youth, where I remember thinking about this idea of a disaster and what could happen in a disaster. It was when I was a Boy Scout. And of course, the motto of Boy Scouts is be prepared, right? So Boy Scouts are all about being prepared for things. But I was maybe 10 or 12, and we had a speaker come, and he came to talk, kind of like I'm doing, about disasters. But he was telling us about the big one. And this was Western Washington State in the 90s. And this is just at the point where we're starting to realize there could be a really big earthquake in this region. And if you don't know about that, I'll talk a bit more about it later. Hopefully you've come across that concept where there could be a big earthquake and a tsunami in our area. And what sticks in my mind really vividly was the fact that this person who came and spoke to us, he had painted a painting that showed our local lighthouse, and it showed a massive tsunami wave cresting over it. And it had an oil tanker on the top of that, launching it onto our lighthouse. And that stuck in my mind. And I've tried since then on the internet to find this painting, and I couldn't. So I did a drawing for you. This is my representation of what this looked like, me as an impressionable young Boy Scout on the one side, and this painting of an oil tanker being heaved over the lighthouse. And I tell you this story to tell you a bit about me, but also because I want to get the point across that disaster experiences are personal, even if it's a disaster that we haven't experienced yet, such as a major earthquake in this region. And that's kind of where a core part of my interest in this topic came from. So fast forward a bit, I actually, before coming to my PhD program here at UBC, I actually went abroad, and I lived for 7 years in Eastern Europe, in the country called Albania, just north of Greece, and across the Adriatic Sea from Italy. And in Albania, I was working for a nonprofit called Cultural Heritage Without Borders. And the mission and vision of this organization was to restore historic buildings. A lot of the people working there were architects, and the target was buildings that had been destroyed as part of the conflicts in the Balkans in the 90s or because of disasters. And the idea was that if you can restore some of these historic buildings that are meaningful for people in their community, that then actually that will help people recover this sense of place as they're recovering from a conflict or disaster. And as part of that work, I had the chance to encounter this idea of first aid for cultural heritage. This was a concept where after it's safe to do so, so when the life-saving operations are finished and you can enter into an area that's been damaged by, say, an earthquake or by a fire or a flood, then actually it'd be great to have some people who are maybe museum curators or architects that can go in and they can stabilize some of the historic buildings that are there, or they can help people to salvage their photographs from their collection or or museum objects that might be damaged in a fire or a flood. And so the idea is that culture helps people to feel grounded back in their community, and culture is a way that people can start to recover and start to bring back some sense of normalcy to their lives. And so working on this kind of work inspired me to kind of go back to grad school and think, why? Why is this the case? And how might this work in other parts of the world? So I want to take a brief jump into anthropology, which is my field that I work in, and just talk about what is anthropology. So, maybe you've seen anthropologists in popular culture on TV show Bones, or archaeologists, like the most famous one, who's questionably an archaeologist, with the hat and the whip, Indiana Jones. But really, anthropology is obviously much more than that. It's the study of people at its core. Here in North America, often it's divided into 4 sort of subgroups. You have biological anthropology, which looks at the human body and how humans have changed and developed over time. You have archaeology. That's a part of anthropology, looking at material remains from long past and what we can learn from that. You have linguistic anthropology, which looks at language and how people communicate with each other and symbols. And then you have cultural anthropology, which kind of looks at all those things and everything else. It's a big catch-all bucket that just asks, what does it mean to be human? So what are the different ways that we express our humanity through different practices, how we share our emotions, how we express our identity, how we form a society and solve problems together. So that's really at the core of anthropology. And so the subtitle of this talk actually is A View from Anthropology. And that was really intentional because anthropology believes that it's not just about the one view. It's just one perspective. My perspective on this is unique to me. And if I'll talk to you, you might have a completely different perspective. And so it's a view because of anthropology embracing all the diversity of human viewpoints. So anthropologists really study how and why people think and act the way they do. And they do that really importantly through firsthand observation and fieldwork. The technique actually is called participant observation in anthropology because it's about people going out into the community, speaking with people, not only conducting maybe surveys, which could be part of anthropological work, but really getting into the daily lives and discussing and participating in what people do and trying to learn from the inside in that way. So anthropology's approach to disasters, to start off here, it's really not that much different from a lot of other disaster studies. So you're looking at disaster as being a risk at the intersection of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. So a hazard, of course, being anything that could harm you, like a volcano, like I have here, an earthquake, a flood. These are hazards, but by themselves, unless you have exposure, an earthquake that happens in the middle of the desert where there's no one or nothing going on, that's not going to become a disaster, right? You have to be exposed to this possible hazard. There has to be people or buildings or something in the vicinity that can be damaged by that. And then the last part of that is vulnerability. So if there's no chance that a disaster, or sorry, if the hazard is no chance of harming you, even if you're exposed to it, then you're not vulnerable to that, and you still wouldn't have a disaster. But vulnerability really recognizes this idea that hazards don't affect people equally. So you might have flooding that really affects people who had to live in a floodplain because they couldn't afford to live elsewhere in some cases. Or you have a case of earthquakes that knock down the weakest building because people might not have had a chance to upgrade their building or make it stronger. So you have different people might be more vulnerable to the effects of a hazard than others, and that's what a disaster comes from. So thinking about this idea then of vulnerability, anthropologists would say that that's an example of disasters being a social phenomenon. So really there's these societal and institutional factors that affect what the risk of disaster is going to be. Of course, there's not only societal factors, you have the physical nature of the hazard itself, the physical power of the earth in many cases. So it's this idea of nature and culture coming together. And this is often something that anthropologists will look at is how people react with their environment and with other people in that context. The other aspect is that disasters are always historically embedded. So we often think of the single event as being the disaster. Say, when the earthquake strikes and everything shakes, that's a disaster. But the way that anthropologists and others think about it in terms of being historically embedded is that the situation that set up the risk was going on for a long time before that. So you had building codes, you have higher or lower levels of risk based on institutional decisions and personal decisions that happened over time. And then the disaster can also continue after that. So when the event happens, say the flood or the tsunami or the earthquake, and then it's over and the waters recede, the ground stops shaking, at that moment, the disaster for some people is just beginning. And then at the same time that they're going through a recovery phase, they're also experiencing the effects of the disaster. So it's really a long continuum. So I wanted to look at, what are some of the ways that anthropologists writing about this right now approach disasters? So these are some questions kind of guiding the research of anthropologists in really recent books. This one's just out this year by anthropologist A.J. Foss. And Foss asks in his introduction, he says, what if we look beyond the hazard, so beyond that event itself, to interrogate those relations, materialities, narratives, emotions, institutions, and organizations. So it's a long list of all the things he's looking at. He says we need a shorthand for all that to understand where disasters come from. Another anthropologist named Roberto Barrios, who has a book titled Governing Affect that came out just recently, a few years back, he asks, why do people make certain worlds and not others? So why do people create a certain reality? And why do categorizations and hierarchies, primarily historical and social in origin, come to be seen as a natural and necessary way of structuring societies? So what he was looking at in his book was this idea of when we recover from disaster, what are the decisions that are made? And why do those seem normal and other decisions that are made don't seem normal? He was looking at flooding events in Illinois, but also the Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana, and I think also some events in Honduras. So how am I approaching then? So as an anthropology student, this is part of my training, is going out and learning through this lens about disasters and disaster planning. So what I'm curious though about is how do place-based values inform planning for disasters? And in particular then, what kinds of human and place relations, so how we relate to our neighborhoods, how we relate to our neighbors in a specific place, how is that produced through process of planning and for disaster recovery in Vancouver? So I'm trying to look at the long term and thinking about how we think ahead about the possibility of facing maybe a major earthquake within our lifetimes, or maybe not, in Vancouver, and how we make decisions about that. And before I come back to Vancouver, I'd like to take us around the world to show some examples of that I'm familiar with about how heritage and culture come into play when communities are thinking about disasters. So first off, we'll go back to Albania, where I spent a lot of time, to the southern Albanian city of Gjirokastra. which is known very fittingly as the City of Stone. And you can see probably why. The city is very famous for cobblestone streets and these very, very large, impressive stone houses. So that's maybe 3-4 stories tall, and stone on the lower layer, plaster and wood on the top floor there. And actually, you can't tell in this photo, but the roof is also slate stone, so extremely solid, almost like mini castles. And this is really good for the seasons and the climate there, because they have really chilly winters, and they use the lower floors with the thick walls and big fireplaces for the winters, and then they have hot summers, and so they go up to the upper floors with the big windows and the balconies, and you experience summer up there, and it's wonderful, and it's cooler. But at the same time, they're also very, very good for earthquakes. Albania is a very seismically active area, and the way that these buildings are constructed, they're very solid on the bottom and they're lighter on the top. These big, thick stone walls. And then into the traditional construction of the buildings, on this photo, you can see there's these bands going up. This was a house that was unfortunately gutted by a fire. It's since then been rebuilt, but because of the fire, it actually allows us to see the structure of the walls. And these are bands of wood that go all the way around the house. And the way that these were built into the building was kind of at about the point where the stonemasons were done working for the day. They would lay this wood around before going on to the next layer. And it's about every 50 to 70 centimeters or so up the wall. And what this does is these wooden ties are actually holding the building together like a belt. Very similar to the way that we do seismic interventions in buildings today, so that if the earth moves, the walls will move together. And this is part of the traditional architectural style, part of the heritage that's been passed down and that traditional knowledge within this society. For the next example, I want to go to the other side of the world, to Tohoku, Japan. And this photo and the next one are photos actually from a recent exhibit at MOA, which I don't know if anyone had a chance to go out and see it. It was really wonderful. It's not on anymore, but I think you can still find a bit online about it. The exhibit's called A Future for Memory, Art and Life After the Great East Japan Earthquake. And it looked at different cultural ways that people were remembering and recovering from the triple disaster in 2011, where you had the major earthquake, the tsunami, and then the nuclear radioactivity. And this is a photo from the town of Misanriku, which you can see the town itself was completely leveled by the tsunami in that event. But at the foot of the stairs here, in the corner of this photo, you have the entranceway to a shrine, which is totally untouched. And the shrine itself is up the hill, but even the entryway is fine. And the commentary on this photo actually was that when this shrine was built, people had passed on the knowledge of how far tsunamis had come in the past. And this being one of the oldest buildings in the town, survived because that knowledge had been passed down or had been in place when it was built about where tsunamis had come in the past, and it was able to survive. An example of traditional knowledge of the sacred landscape in sort of shrines and temples, serving actually as important disaster knowledge as well. Another example from Japan, from the same event, is from Kesanuma City. This is a city really famous for its local carpentry. The carpenters and the woodworkers are really, really well known. And this street that this building was on was kind of the historical center of town, so historic sort of wood building structure. And what I thought was really great was the way that this was characterized by the local curator in talking about this photo. And they wrote that culture is not equal to cultural property. Culture is an accumulation of people's lives. We do not think our culture has been destroyed. And to me, that was really powerful, because what this city is known for, of course, is the skill of the craftspeople, the skill of the woodworkers. And if those people were able to survive, as most of them, of course, did, then they could rebuild places like this. So the culture and the heritage resides foremost within people. And if the people are there, then they can put to work their hands and rebuild these places. All right, so moving now back to our part of the world, to the Pacific Northwest. And this next story will be one that probably some of you are already familiar with. But in case anyone's not, I'm going to tell it because to me, it's an incredibly remarkable story about how indigenous cultural knowledge, archival research, and geoscience all came together to help us understand the history and potential of major earthquakes in this region. And actually, Professor John Clegg from SFU, who was the previous speaker in this series, was an integral part of that story as well. So it's really a privilege to be able to follow him and talk about this as well. So of course, as we know, indigenous people have been here for thousands and thousands of years, and they have been passing down their history orally from generation to generation. Peoples of the Northwest Coast have been telling stories of when the ground shook, or when water put canoes as high as the trees, and tales like this. And for many of the first non-indigenous people that came, these sounded like mythological stories, and they were treated as myths rather than as history. But actually, a few decades ago, scientists started discovering along the coastline, up and down from Oregon all the way up to BC, what they call these ghost forests. And I have an illustration I made kind of what that sort of looks like if you haven't seen one. A ghost forest is all of these dead trees in an area, usually kind of near the coast, but not necessarily right on the coast, that all died very suddenly. And people were discovering that these trees had mysteriously died all of a sudden, and they were dating them to about 300 years ago. All of a sudden, they had all had an influx of salt water and died. And so this indicated that potentially there was something like a tsunami that had come in, and the ground had subsided rapidly at a major earthquake event. So how we know, though, that the last major subduction zone earthquake to happen in this region was at around 9 p.m. on the 26th of January, 1700, is remarkable as well, because at the time that this information was coming to light, someone was doing research in the archives of Japan. And Japanese have archival records on earthquake events and tsunamis going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And turns out, on that very date, 26th of January, someone had recorded that there was a tsunami that showed up, and they called it an orphan tsunami. And this was a shock because they hadn't felt any ground movement. A tsunami had shown up with no warning and a lot of destruction because of that. That's why it was noted. But there had been no earthquake to warn of it. And so from this knowledge, we've been able to piece together the fact that the earthquake, or the tsunami, the earthquake that generated that, must have been on the other side of the Pacific, near this region. And then based on the time that the wave arrived in Japan and the force of it, we could kind of estimate that it was a major earthquake, and that it happened around 9 in the evening on the 26th of January, 1700, which to me is remarkable. And it's this way that different forms of knowledge and different forms of cultural knowledge from indigenous peoples and Japanese archives and geoscience on the coast could really come together to create this understanding of earthquake risk in the region. And so one example of actually where you can read about this story, and this is an exhibition that is still up. If you haven't, I really recommend you head out to the Museum of Anthropology out at UBC and check out, it's called Shake Up, Preserving What We Value. And this tells this story, but also other stories of earthquake knowledge and resilience around the world, as well as earthquake preparedness, what to do in this part of the world. And it also talks about the seismic upgrade process that MOAA is undergoing right now. So, one approach to taking on this knowledge about earthquakes is to actually take action to protect the people and cultural belongings and cultural knowledge in the places where that resides. And so actually, some of you might be aware that this is the Great Hall at MOAA, where the red circle is in this image. And for a while, it was actually the most seismically dangerous space to be in, or one of the most dangerous spaces in BC, and particularly in the Lower Mainland. So actually, the decision was made to take that down and rebuild it. And I have a photo from last month, actually, that I took when I was on my way over. This is the process right now. And just to zoom in a bit, what they're doing is they're putting in a layer underneath the floor. Before they rebuild the Great Hall, they're putting it on base isolators. And what that means is these pillars will actually hold the hall. And if the ground starts shaking, the hall above will not move, or it won't move very much in relation to the earth. So it will kind of act as a buffer between the ground and the Great Hall, preventing it from falling over. Which to me is remarkable. It's an amazing, complex technological solution in order to create as safe a space as you could possibly create in an earthquake zone. And it shows that, something we value, along with human lives, which would be saved by putting this in, is the cultural belongings. This is the hall where a lot of really important and impressive totem poles of First Nations were held and will continue to reside after. And it's also, the building itself is an important architectural landmark, having been designed by Arthur Erickson. The hall was taken down, but will actually be reconstructed in the same manner that it was originally built. So one last example from Vancouver here, something that's been really interesting to me in my sort of neighborhood-based work here in Dunbar and over on East Vancouver, is corner stores. And how those actually came to take on a certain special importance during the COVID pandemic. And thinking about these corner stores and thinking about them historically, these very small, usually they're in sort of the middle of residential neighborhoods. They might be on a corner. They might not actually be on a corner. But the idea is they're often small scale grocery stores or little shops. Traditionally, they provided a lot of opportunities for new immigrants to have a business in Vancouver. They're a really quirky part of local identity of various neighborhoods. And they're places where people can, create and recreate community ties, seeing people they know. If you're a regular customer, you might know the people working there. And during the pandemic, they provided essential services like food. We have the West Side Market here has food and flowers and all sorts of things. Just down on 16th. Found and Freed is over on Victoria in East Vancouver, and used to be Scott's Market, actually, so an actual food market. Now it's more of a used furniture and clothing store. And really, during the pandemic, when we couldn't go far from home, especially in those early days, when you're encouraged to stay in your neighborhood, these places took on a renewed significance. They allowed for some community interaction when work and schools were closed. They helped us to walk to places that we needed to go to stay local rather than taking transit or going further away. But corner stores had also, you may know, been very legally precarious for decades in Vancouver. The zoning bylaws assumed that they would all eventually disappear, and actually encouraged that process of disappearing corner stores. Corner stores were allowed to remain where they had been prior to, I think it was 1973 or 76, sometime in the 70s, but new ones could not be opened. And if one closed for a certain amount of time, it would be hard to reopen it. And so there was concern that if these stores had to close during COVID, none of them would reopen again or be allowed to. And actually then during the pandemic, there was a push then to make it easier to have these exist in our neighborhoods. And there was actually a change to the zoning regulations put in place, partly because of the way that people were interacting with these places and not wanting to see them disappear. And this image on the right here, actually, I show you was you can maybe make out this window in the front, which I believe, I haven't done the archive research to prove it exactly, but it looks to me like a storefront. But the building is not a shop or anything now. It's completely a house. But I have a feeling this was one of those sort of corner stores that then later lost its status as that. Probably not in the last couple of years, but sometime in the last few decades. So just in the last couple minutes here, I want to ask, why does this matter? And maybe it won't to you, and that's okay. As an anthropologist, I can be okay with that. And I want to know why it doesn't matter to you. But I'll tell you a couple reasons, 2 reasons why it matters to me and why I think it's important within my research. One is that decision making related to disasters can affect communities for generations. So decisions that are made in the early moments of recovery of disaster really shape the landscape of our neighborhoods. And so I think it's important to have an idea of what's important about our neighborhoods ahead of time in order to understand and know where we'd want to go in the future. Thinking about the corner stores, until recently those were all technically non-conforming to the zoning code. And so if a major earthquake had happened, like was feared in the pandemic, if those buildings were damaged and had to be reconstructed, before that zoning change, all of those remaining small shops in the neighborhoods would have had to go. So that's one example of that. Another example is thinking about things like Vancouver schools. I'm sure many of you know that there's been large ongoing projects to seismically retrofit and upgrade a lot of the schools in Vancouver. It's wonderful to have, we need safe schools so that our children are safe in earthquakes. I think most people can agree on that approach. But then there's a lot of decisions that come into that that maybe people don't agree on so much. Should a building be torn down and replaced? Should it just be retrofitted? Should the new building be as big as the old school building? Should it have the same spaces for arts or for music or for sports? These are all debates that come into disaster-related planning when we talk about seismically retrofitting schools. Another issue is climate change, thinking about the effects of climate change. Whether it's more carbon efficient to retrofit a building or to build a new building. These things make a big difference in the shape of our city. The other thing I want to talk about is the fact that closer knit communities just fare better in disasters because people look out for one another. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about my experience in terms of that. But really it just comes down to community connectivity, knowing your neighbors. And so groups like DEEP give you a lot of practical skills, things like what to have in, this is actually from UBC, but similar knowledge you'll get from DEEP as well, what you should have in an emergency kit, what supplies should you have on hand in case something happens. How to shut off your gas line if there's an earthquake, so you don't blow up your house or something like that. Those are really important skills to know. But the other thing that DEEP gives you, which I think is equally important, is this idea that you can start to know your neighbors. So activities like Map Your Neighborhood, which is about bringing together people on your block and talking about disaster preparedness, but even more so, just having a party and getting to know each other. That can be really key. So, taking into account cultural differences, which everyone has their own approach to how they want to live in their neighborhood, but everyone also has their own strengths that they can draw on as far as being a part of that neighborhood and contributing to it. And so the idea is, what kind of neighborhood culture are we building? So other neighborhood groups that I feel like actually prepare us to withstand disasters also even go beyond DEEP. So there's the Grandview Heritage Group that I've been working with a bit on the east side of Vancouver, which really takes a long-term approach to community connectedness and to identity and a very strongly rooted sense of place in their neighborhood. There's the Vancouver Arts Colloquium Society, which has had projects about art and earthquake resilience and how those things come together to kind of think about rebuilding a community. And even the Emerging Elders program that VAX has right now, is about connecting elders and youth, which is a really important way of sustaining community ties and passing on knowledge. And then, of course, places like this, the community center. Vancouver, I've lived here now for only 4 years, so most of it's been during the pandemic. But this network of community centers is still incredible to me, and an incredible resource, I would say, for disaster preparedness, and not only because some of them operate as disaster support hubs, with some supplies and things like that, but especially because of the community building aspect of it. So just to wrap up, disaster preparedness and mitigation efforts are often sort of divided into two categories. You have hard and you have soft. So the hard measures are things like levees or seawalls or hardened infrastructure that really kind of, block flooding or keep things safe. Soft measures are often things like raising awareness or providing information, or for me, these type of deeper, longer lasting neighborhood community connections. And so I wouldn't argue, I'm not here to say that soft measures are better than hard measures or anything like that, or to compare them. But just to say that hard measures, we often invest tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into putting in place. And that makes it really easy, I think, to overestimate their relative worth when comparing them to these so-called soft measures. And I think that the soft measures have a stronger impact than we give them credit for in terms of preparing us for disasters and helping us to respond together as a community. And so one big contribution of anthropology and I hope of my project is to be able to understand those soft measures better and how they work. So thank you everybody for listening. I really appreciate coming out on this foggy night. And yeah, happy to answer questions or discuss it all.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. Any questions from those that are here in person before we check online?
Yeah.
It's just prompting thoughts as I've listened to you, and it was very inspiring to get that perspective from. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The neighborhood I'm in is on the county corridor, and there's a lot of transient residents because they're not able to afford to stay in one place for long. Their sense of neighborhood is not there. As a block watch captain, it's hard to get investment there, or even to deliver information.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that challenge there, but also I'm noticing that coffee houses are cropping up in condo buildings. Easton Falls suddenly here on 41st in the park or condo, but also the United Church, Corporate United. So that's interesting to me as a modern corner store, perhaps. Maybe
Yes.
that will evolve into something like a corner store. And the other one is down at 33rd off Queen Elizabeth Park in that big condo development there. So yeah, culture, anthropology, people change. It's constant change.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I agree. Culture is something that is dynamic and is changing constantly. Mm-hmm. But there's certain things I think that we do rely on and appreciate, which are, like you're saying, these coffee places, these places we can gather in our community. And one thing that attracts me is when, but because of course we're going to always have new buildings coming in. But if they can be buildings that create spaces that are, maybe having multiple small storefronts instead of one large one, gives us more of a chance to have these small local businesses and these kind of like varied opportunities within the neighborhood, which is nice. So it sounds like, yeah, there's some of that with those new coffee shops that are going in.
Well, in schools, because it was 20 years ago when my kids were in elementary school, and I went to the earthquake preparedness conference, two conferences, and nothing really came of it at the school board level. But just changing the mindset, as you're pointing out, we have to duplicate the original structure of the building. So who can you liaise with to change that mindset going forward? The architecture, who designs the schools, and where can you put your influence there?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that question.
But
it's a really important thing to think about, and it will of course be different in everyone's community. Who those decision makers are, and how what are the different ways to engage in those processes will be varied for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, Jonathan, I really reacted to your question of what kind of neighborhoods are what kind of neighborhoods we're actually working towards. In contrast to this lady over here, we live on a block that is not very transient at all, although there are a lot of new, relatively wealthy people from Asia living in the neighborhood. So we've had a neighborhood party, but that's sort of summertime, some hot dogs and some people bring over things to share food with. But just how prepared we would be in an actual situation where we had to help people significantly, say some injuries and all the rest of it, with a lot of language barriers as well. It's a worry for me. Anyway, I'm just not that confident that we're. What I'd really like to have is like a two-day power outage, you know, in the winter, when we'd have to really start to help people.
This is, I mean, it's interesting you should say that, because I, you know, looking at sort of research on disasters from all sorts of different places, you know, there's a lot of concern often from authorities about the breakdown of sort of law and order and things like that. But in most cases that I've heard of, you know, there's a lot of mutual aid, you know, and people actually, you know, are brought together in adversity. So it's interesting you say this, yeah, you know, I wish we could have a power outage just to come together, you know, sort of thing. And there's actually a really excellent book about that by a journalist named Rebecca Solnit, and it's called A Paradise Built in Hell. And it's about those sort of brief communities of mutual aid that people put together in all sorts of, it talks about the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, about the Halifax explosion in 1917, I think, about I think an earthquake in Mexico, a couple other examples. And yeah, it talks about this. So I guess one thing that we can feel a bit less gloomy about is that even if we're sort of less together ahead of an event than we would like to be. I mean, we could always be more, you know, more neighborly, but life gets in the way. I know that's the case absolutely for me, especially living out at UBC where people are rotating all the time, kind of like the Canby corridor you were talking about, a lot of change. But also know that, you know, human nature, in my experience, is such that adversity will also bring us together. So, you know, we can do as much as possible to connect ahead of time, but also whatever efforts we can make to connect and be neighborly in the moment of need also will go a long way. It's a long way. Great point that you made, but yeah.
I'm thinking that I'm probably overthinking this, and that we're going to be, I'm not looking for, I don't think there's going to be any law and order falling apart.
Yeah.
It's just that some people aren't going to be helped properly. There might be some senior that we forgot about in some basement somewhere, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so that's really, you know, a key. When you do know your neighbors, you can know who's more vulnerable, you know, if something happens, and who to check on. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, any other questions from the room? Okay, do we have any questions from the online audience?
Not yet, but they can unmute and ask.
Okay, if you want to ask a question, just unmute and ask the question to Jonathan.
And if you're shy, my email is up there. I'm also happy to chat with people.
All right then, well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And thanks again for the effort and the support you've given us. And thank Christian for your IT work for this, and thank for everyone who's attending. So thank you everyone very much.
Thank you so much.
There goes